All right, welcome everybody to the SNIA Experts on Data podcast. Super excited because we've got an amazing panel of experts and fantastic humans that I'm joining today to have a great discussion around the experts on data when it comes to practice areas in SNIA. So we've brought a lot of neat things around focus areas, and today we're going to talk about protect. And you're probably going to say, what does that mean? That's why I've got these amazing folks with me. And oh, by the way, my name is Eric Wright. I'm the Chief Content Officer and co-founder of GTM Delta, and also the lucky host of the SNIA Experts on Data podcast. And with that, I'm going to take us around the room and introduce the incredible panel. We'll start with Michael. Do you want to give a quick intro yourself, and then we'll get rolling through the crowd?
Thank you, Eric. My name is Michael Dexter. I'm an independent support provider in Portland, Oregon. I'm very active in open source circles, and I host 3 calls a week, one on containers, one on OpenZFS, and one on hypervisors.
Well, I'm glad we could sneak in between those. Thank you very much for joining. Eric Hibbard, thank you. Not just because you're amazing, because you have a great first name, but there's definitely a lot more that I'm a real big fan of with you, Eric.
Thank you, Eric. So I actually, in SNIA, chair the Security Technical Work Group. My day job is with Samsung Semiconductor, and I deal with NAND and SSDs, and very active in the security and privacy standardization activities, IEEE, ISO, things of that nature.
Fantastic. And Munir, a return guest to the podcast. So for folks that haven't already caught it, you should go back and check it out. Munir and I had a fantastic conversation, and this is why you're a perfect fit as well for the panel today. We're going to talk about a lot of the stuff we kind of touched on a bit there and how it affects the total data focus area. So Munir, if you don't mind doing a quick intro.
My pleasure, actually. My name is Munir, and mostly I'm a senior manager with Ernst & Young. I've been in the industry for more than 35 years, all around data protection, data retention, and data archival. I have held a lot of disaster recovery, business continuity, and ransomware protection across my career, and I'd be happy to be a member of this discussion panel.
Fantastic. And John, I can say that you love Kioxia so much that it's your middle name. That's I love your tags that I get to see on here. So John, you want to do a quick introduction? Then we're going to jump into the chat.
Sure. So hi, I'm John Geldman. I'm employed by Kioxia. I get to lead their standards activity in general. It's fair to say I am a standards geek. I am also on the SNIA board and active in most committees you can name, including a lot that Eric runs.
Now, the fun part is that we get to stay on you for a second, John, because one of the things we have with the practice areas is really understanding what does it mean. You know, the data focus areas are curious to folks from the outside. So let's kind of fresh start. No one knows who we are. Let's talk SNIA and the protect data focus area.
All right. So today I'm here to introduce this talk on one of SNIA's focus areas to secure and protect data. I'd like to call out 2 of the active groups that SNIA has focusing on this area, the data protection and privacy community. It generates marketing and educational materials, and the storage security technical work group that generates standards, provides comments on various domestic and international standards, provides support to other SNIA technical work groups, and works with many of SNIA's alliance partners. By the way, I also co-chair that group. Now, the SNIA Online Dictionary, which you haven't seen it, is a great tool. Describes data protection as the sorry, I had something pop up. As the combination of data integrity, data availability, and confidentiality. I'm going to throw in data privacy as a 4th element. That's ensuring that data has not been altered, ensuring that data is available, even if there are physical failures, ensuring that data is only accessible by authorized parties, and what does it actually mean for a person to have control over their personal data. Each of these elements is complex, multiple aspects, approaches. Each of these 4 elements are affected by ongoing development of media, new data organizational frameworks, and also by the growing capabilities of quantum computing that affects our cryptography. Each of those elements is supported by a combination of cryptographic systems and permission systems and data redundancies and regulations. For system and developers, we use all of that stuff, except usually the regulations. Now, the lawyers and legislators, that's different. There are now laws on the books that have consequences if you aren't doing the right things in these areas. If your company is responsible for data breaches or doesn't appropriately provide control over personal data. And now that I've got that scary thought going, I'll turn this over.
Nothing like opening on a bright note. And it's funny that you did highlight something that I think we're probably going to spend a good time digging down into across the whole panel, is the difference between sort of technical capabilities, the implications of that as an operational challenge, and then the third pillar being the regulatory challenge that comes along with it. And that is, regional as well. So you talked about some of the fun part of as lawmakers enter the conversation. And maybe let's kind of start as we look at defining data protection. You were looking at how the U.S. focuses on it versus, there's not a person in this audience who likely hasn't heard the phrase, the letters GDPR. And while that may not necessarily seem like a thing that we'd be talking about at SNIA, it really does go all the way down to the metal, because there are capabilities that we're having from the very, very lowest possible, viewpoint that will traverse to the point where they are, bound by regulations and excitement. So who wants to, I'm going to open this up and I'll see who gets the fastest to the mic on this one, but let's talk about, that sort of market definition and why it's regionally different.
So I could probably take that one since I do quite a bit of work in the privacy space. Yeah, you're right. It does get all the way down to the metal, so to speak, and you can use the GDPR, since you invoked the well-known acronym, because something as, quote, simple as destruction of data could constitute a data breach. And that was one of the big sort of eye-opening things for a lot of folks, and especially in the storage industry, because I think up until that point, we always thought of a data breach as unauthorized access, but that in fact is not the case. Corruption and destruction can get you in just as much hot water as unauthorized access. That said, GDPR was a sort of second move by the European Union to try and get this right. They've since been followed by a bunch of different jurisdictions. So places like China, for example, have very, very strict laws in this space. In the US, we're a bit schizophrenic when it comes to privacy regulations. At this point, I believe every state has something on the books, and they vary significantly. California, where I think John and I are at, has some of the more stringent requirements, but Massachusetts has got its own sort of version. None of them are tracking like GDPR at the moment. The focus is a little bit different, and we don't get too worried about things like IP addresses and things like that, where the Europeans are very fussy. Even photographs and whatnot are protected informations in certain settings. So we haven't crossed over into that space. It's unclear that we will see any serious privacy regulation. In the U.S., if I had to speculate, it would probably take a path that would preempt some of the more stringent that are on the books in some of the states. So I think the chaos factor we've got in the U.S. is going to continue.
I can say it coming from I'm Canadian by birth, as my Texan accent always gives away here. But I worked for let's just say a large insurance company that rhymes with Fun Life. Anybody who goes back to LinkedIn will easily tell where I was from. But I was really exposed early to the idea that it's not just, as a company you have requirements, but it was as a company per location, because there were provincial regulations around the types of data we can hold and maintain, and then it became country to country, of course, because it's a global company. And I did get that early exposure to it. And like you said, I think, Eric, you brought it up, was the idea that we think of it as exfiltration, like the removal and selling or publication of data is what people see as like the sacrosanct, the ultimate thing. But in fact, just possessing and holding the data still has an incredible amount of regulatory stuff attached to it. And when we think of like right to be forgotten, I think was one of the really interesting parts of legislation that came out of the EU. And that introduces a whole exciting thing that takes us down to that. So maybe, on that, what does it mean, as a standards development body, when we see something like that come from the regulatory side? How do we then parlay that down through the rest of our organizations and how we handle it?
Well, I mean, somebody who's heavily involved in like ISO standards, we don't cross over into the regulatory space. In fact, this is something that we have to be extremely careful about, because, like in the case of some of the work in, the ISO subcommittee 27, which deals with security and privacy, that's a little more expanded than that. We have on the order of 75 national bodies represented. So one size would not fit all from a regulatory perspective. So the standards tend to dodge that issue. The twist is that it's not uncommon for regulations to actually cite certain standards. So there is a relationship, but in general, the standards try to avoid, kind of getting.
I'll note that I would tend to agree with Eric. We don't really touch them in the standards, but I know for what I do, I get called for advice from legal about export rules from different places. Just when we need to put our product specifications, not our standards, out, that's actually part of what we need to control carefully, where we're actually exporting trade secret information.
Remember the days when even just running the wrong version of Netscape could actually get you in trouble? Like remember there was a 40-bit and a 128-bit version. Like it's kind of wild that we take for granted how easy it is to just grab software and put it down on our systems these days. And then when it comes to, data protection in general, and again, we sort of take it for granted that what we assume when we hear data protection, it means backup. But that's actually like one sliver of it. So maybe on that, what is the difference between security, privacy, and the storage, elements of data, of this protect data focus area?
Maybe I can step in here.
Go for it, Munir.
Yeah, the idea here is when you talk about data protection in general, our thoughts within the infrastructure resources is that it's protection from data loss, data corruption, data unavailability, by providing what you just said, Eric, the backup as an example, maybe replication, maybe cloning, maybe snapshotting. All this is to protect the physical capability of the data. To protect the data from prying eyes, that is data privacy. So we always tend to mix, as Eric Hebert just said, it's the line separating those two items is very blurred. So it's very important for the end user to understand what is he protecting from. Like, for example, if your data is on your local device that is not connected to anything, so it is unlikely to be accessible to prying eyes. This is protected from the privacy point of view, but that does never protect you from hardware failure or data loss. So these are the barriers or the separations between the data privacy concept and the data protection concept.
I might put a slightly different spin on that. Because, so privacy, as a practicing privacy professional, there's a legalist. So I would say what Munir described is probably more from a confidentiality perspective. Privacy's got a legal regime, regulatory regime that, and to use his example, the fact that you might have certain data on that laptop might actually be a privacy violation, but it wouldn't be a confidentiality issue because it's not connected. And so understanding, I mean, that may sound like a subtle difference, but it's not. You may not be authorized to have anything to do with certain data that's sitting on your laptop. So privacy has a dependency on some of the security aspects. And you said earlier, availability, integrity, confidentiality. Said it the wrong way. I should have said the CIA sort of wording. But security itself doesn't actually care about privacy from a regulatory perspective. And that's, one of the interesting challenges. Coming back to Munir's comment about data protection through kind of the lens of storage, there is, from a security perspective, there's kind of an assumption that you're doing the storage side of things correctly, because there are concerns about like business continuity and things of that nature. So there's a little bit of so privacy has some dependencies on sort of the security community. The security community kind of has some dependencies on sort of the storage oriented aspects of data protection, but it's subtle in many cases, how strong that dependency actually is.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing you brought up, Eric, is this idea that it's almost like kinetic and potential, as we talk about in the sense of energy, in that the data you have on your machine has the potential to be something. It's not necessarily actively, at a point where it's at risk of exploit, but just the fact that data is possessed on that drive introduces could be a regulatory issue. And that's why it's such a careful dance. I thought I just had to call my storage team up. I didn't realize that I had to call legal every time I need to ask one of these questions, but that almost is this interesting boundary. And Mike, I'm going to come into you for the hot take. There's got to be something. How do you explain this when you're talking to your community, and what's the angle at which you look at this from this security, privacy, and protection?
So one of the key aspects of privacy is it really is about somebody's personal information and control of it. And so if it doesn't have to do with that person, then it's not a privacy concern with that person. So it's the sharing of that information, and whether it's still there or not, or whether it is allowed to be shared in other places, which is important. When we talk about confidentiality in general, it's a really general thing about, are only the people who are supposed to have access to that having access to that. So if the company has decided that it's okay to have a database of names and phone numbers, and everybody has access to it, then we need to make sure that only the people who are supposed to have that have that.
Except that's a good example, John, in that I think many companies discovered very quickly when GDPR went into force that detail actually was regulated. And if you had European employees, so if it was like an internal, you were actually suddenly forced to deal with that to comply with GDPR. And in many cases, people would split up their call centers so that they would be, in certain regions, or they would say, we can't keep this. Oh, look, we got 25 years worth of records. Why do we have this? There was a lot of soul searching that kind of went on. But yeah, I think more generically, Eric, to a comment that you kind of asked, and HIPAA in the U.S. is one of those examples. There were a huge number of organizations that had some kind of healthcare information stored away, squirreled away somewhere. HIPAA goes into force. Now everybody's got to scramble to figure out, what do we actually have on, what do we got stored? Because now it's suddenly, it's now regulated and you've got to basically deal with it. This happens all the time with the regulatory space. As John pointed out, personal information is a little easier to track because you know what to chase, but we're seeing regulations pop up. California a while back had an IoT oriented regulation where all of a sudden, am I an IoT company? and it depended on the definition, which was basically everything but routers. So we get hit with these things where we've got to sort of skulk through the data to figure out what we have and how do we have to protect it.
And it's such a tough challenge too as technologists, because we live in this intermediary space where we have to understand the regulatory impact, but then we also have to relate to the technical capabilities. And that was a great example where, unless it was bolted into a 42U rack, it was considered to be mobile, like that. And that introduces an interesting challenge. Now I'm going to switch the question I brought up to you, Michael, before, because I want to go, let's talk about bottom up. As you look at describing what are the capabilities that we're standardizing that attend to some of these challenges that are being brought up as we're talking about at this regulatory and sort of top level layer?
I'm glad you mentioned that, because you used a phrase like, I need to talk to legal every time I do something. Well, while we have countless storage products out there, the average user, be it small and medium organizations and even rather large ones, do not have storage engineers. And I'm glad SNIA has the storage developer event, because there are very few true storage developers. And so at best, we are handing smaller organizations weapons that are unsafe at any speed. And I'd hope that organizations like SNIA can help bring them these notions that when you are setting up storage, and this was an eye-opener for me, thank you, Eric Hibbert, that the destruction of data is just as important as the protection of data, because your average storage engineer will hold on to that data till the end, and that's their job, and they are failing at their job if you need to destroy that. So bottom up, I think we need tools that are available to all. I personally believe those lie in open source tools, because the vendors are inconsistent at their delivery of data protection solutions. And it's a challenge. There's no question it's a challenge, be it those competing interests of protecting yet carefully deleting, and as you've mentioned, the sudden HIPAA or GDPR requirements. Untangling a rock-solid archive of data can be a nightmare insofar as, if we've succeeded as storage engineers in providing multi-tiered, decades-ready storage, suddenly one user out of 1,000 has the right to be forgotten. How do we take that solid, don't touch it store and extract that one user? So that the challenges are palpable. Every effort is appreciated, and I certainly hope SNIA can play a role in all that. I hope that answers your question to some degree.
That's great. Yeah, and I think this actually, we're going to go to the deepest possible complex thing that has now come to the fore, which is, vector databases being a way in which we store data that's not easy to remove, and this is the problem. We've got people are training models. We're storing models that contain a vast amount of information. We struggle with explainability. And the reason is because it goes down to this idea of like protecting destruction and life cycle of that data. How do we make sure that we can safely and even potentially remove some of that stuff? Now, we're not solving the vector database problem. I pulled as one example, but what are the artifacts that we're dealing with at the metal and up that are being leveraged as we see new tech come in that's going to challenge the methodology?
I'll throw in one key point there that I always come back to in our meetings with DPPC. It's that when there's something new, be it a vector database or something exciting, generally there's a question, well, is it faster, more reliable, or more secure, or cheaper? And so it's still a storage technology. Let's find where it fits in that mix. But yeah, there's always something new and shiny, and there always will be. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, and and part of that, sort of following up on his summary there from the security piece, we typically ask for what happens when you're all done with it. So it's not so much, you could actually have the security problem solved while it's operational in use. But if you haven't thought through what does it mean when I'm all done, then you may have actually exposed yourself to a lot of data breach scenarios at a time. Because if you're getting rid of something or you're shutting operations down, you surely don't want to be dealing with something like this. So, this is a facet that is very important, especially in the storage arena, because we are the guardians of the data, and as I think everybody here is aware, we go to great lengths to squirrel it away in lots of places to ensure it never disappears. But when it's time to make it disappear, we've got to basically deal with that problem.
I had the strangest funny thing that happened years ago. Is I remember that we had workstation style servers. This is back in the early 90s. I'm an older fella, so I've been around since some of the early implementations, and we had a bunch of spare servers. And so what they would come into production, we would take their drives away and move them. So a shelf of servers, shelf of storage. So all these disks, gigantic 256 gigabyte, drives, massive, but I took drives. I'm like, ooh, there's a spare server. And I just took 5 disks, plop, 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 popped it into my nice little tower, and I powered it up. And it took about 3 or 4 minutes, and it came up to a Windows screen. I was like, oh my God, I literally picked a stack of drives that still had controller memory and disk side memory, and it recovered the array. And I just happened to have picked 5 that were in order. So that was a scary moment where I was like, okay, what just happened here? I mentally installed Windows NT. I don't know how this worked.
Actually, this problem now is very common across the internet, the hyperscalers and the cloud providers, where a company or an individual acquires a storage, let's say for a project, and puts some test data or dev data on it to do his development and qualification and certification of the project. And then once he's done, he releases the resource to the cloud provider again to stop billing without removing the data. The next person who picks that data, he's going to be having a lot of fun going through PII data that he can use for multiple purposes. So that's a concern that's always existing, to be true.
Now, personally, I'm a fan of the sanitize command, but I helped invent it, so there you go. But that's a command which is used in hardware devices to really reset everything that's there. One thing I'll share is coming from but I won't give too much status about it, is the ability to purge a namespace, which will be very helpful for logic people for logical storage in the future. But that's not available yet. It's coming.
And I think
it's a lot easier to deal with these logical constructs than it is with the physical constructs.
Yeah, and John said something actually that's worth pouncing on here. He used the term purge, and that in the security world has hopefully has some special meaning to you, because that's essentially a technique that is supposed to hold up to potentially a nation state trying to do a recovery. It should definitely be anti-forensic. So, I mean, if you're using the purge techniques that have been implemented correctly, forensics people should be very unhappy if they're trying to recover data. There should be no way from getting it on the data itself. Now, forensic people are very creative, and systems are notorious for temp space and, again, squirreling data away in a bunch of different locations. And so they may be able to recover it that way. But if you just hand them a drive that's been, purge operations been, executed, there should be nothing available to them or a nation state if done right.
Yeah, and it's to the point where, on the physical side, we used to just literally degauss drives, which was always fun to watch them make little dances for us on these little exciting magnets and heat up. But then, as we move to the cloud, we move to distributed shared storage environments, we don't have the degaussing option. And it's that real understanding of lifecycle goes to the point of termination of the data. And we just easily forget. And when we even talk about backup products, they're not backup products, they're restore products. But we always talk about it in the context of you first have to back it up. But time and time again, it's like, can it be restored? Will the standard for the encryption, because now we're thinking about how do we encrypt and protect at rest in these other areas, and this, whether it's going to be sitting in LTO, whether it's going to be sitting in cold but live storage, whether it's going to be sitting in hot storage in a secondary site. There's so many ways in which we can manage how that data lives and ultimately where it dies.
Yeah, and just as another angle that we're having to deal with, it's related to the sanitization, is when you consider sustainability, going out and destroying drives that are potentially reusable is really becoming less acceptable. I don't think we've sort of quite crossed that line yet. But there are a lot of people that are looking at that situation of like, so how do we eradicate the data on the drive, but leave the drive in a state that it's usable? And this is back to that term that John used earlier, purge, and in particular, the using cryptographic erase, which is essentially, using encryption and certain key management techniques, as in like losing the key intentionally. There's some other conditions that you have to worry about. So not only are we having to worry about eradicating the data, but now we're also having to look at a situation of doing it in a way where we're not causing physical destruction to the underlying storage device or media. And that's it's clear to the storage industry that we've got to deal with this. We see, SNIA is operating in this space for quite some time. The Green Storage Twig has worked with the EPA on a lot of technologies. In the past, we see the Open Compute Project is got an entire sustainability activity. So this is something that the information communications technology industry is basically trying to figure out how to sort of step up and deal with some of this.
Yeah, and that is where we often feel like we're competing interests, because the best way to destroy it would be, burn it with fire, throw it into a volcano. But obviously the impact of doing such is terrifyingly bad for so many other reasons. So we have to think about recycling, but destruction at the data layer with absolute belief and proof that this data is irrecoverable.
Yes.
One of the fun things.
Go ahead, John.
You go. You haven't gone yet.
There is indeed a secondhand market. And in this broader education of, okay, how do we properly sanitize? A consumer sure appreciates knowing the number of hours on a drive, the smart status, the health of that drive, and whatever they can about the history. And there are vendors who are somewhat famous for fudging firmware and somehow having terabytes of data through a drive, but very few hours, which is completely implausible. And so this whole ecosystem is indeed a challenge, and that hasn't quite been solved to our broader satisfaction. Go ahead.
So two interesting things. One is destruction isn't as easy as it used to be. When we can put, multiple Encyclopedia Britannicas on an eighth of my pinky nail, then all of a sudden, if you're trying to shred this, you just can't. You can't get it down to something which is meaningless to a state organization. You have to effectively phase change it. You have to make it go from solid to liquid or something else. You have to melt it. You have to do something to really change it. Now, to erase is actually one of the easier ways to actually get things done if your hardware supports it and can support it. And when we're talking about where we're holding data, if we're actually holding data, which now the data is a database or in an FPGA, we've got a different story on our hands. But we still have this potentially confidentiality and privacy concerns to worry about.
This is, I think, it reminds me that such a perfect conversation, and I only wish we had like another hour to be able to go because there's so much we could dive into. But I think I'll say thematically, I want to wrap by just saying the most important reason why what we're doing in SNIA and collecting amazing folks like everybody I've got here is the fact that we are going to come out of here, as we should, and out of every architecture discussion with a series of questions, not answers. Obviously, we drive toward answers, but the best thing you can have is are all the questions being asked? And I would say that this is probably the number one thing why I recommend people get involved with SNIA, because you're surrounded by other technologists who are experiencing the same problem in parallel with you, and we're all solving it together. So the pace of acceleration of innovation, so much better in this broader tech community. And inevitably, let's not reinvent the wheel, and let's certainly not destroy the wheel in a way that doesn't, protect us from PII being on the wheel. There are so many things that we could do. But I want to say thank you to all the amazing folks. This has been a fantastic conversation. Like I said, there's 1,000 questions I want to ask. I want to have so much fun with everybody, but you've all been great. So for just a quick round, what's the best way that folks can reach you? We're going to start with you, Eric Hibbard. What's the best way if people want to get caught up with you, other than, of course, through directly meeting up at SDC and the SNIA events?
Sure. I'm on email, eric.hibbard@samsung.com, or I'm pretty easy to track down on LinkedIn. So
Munir, again, I recommend people check it out. Munir and I had a fantastic conversation in the past, so do check out some of the other amazing podcasts as well as with other folks that have been on here. So, Munir, how do we get a hold of you if we want to catch up after the fact?
I think the fastest way to access me and potentially everybody on this call is LinkedIn. So our profile is open for anybody who wants to get information or connect, and I'll be happy to respond to any inquiry following on.
Excellent. And Michael?
So by email, editor@callfortesting.org, and on the Fediverse, Dexter@bsd.network.
Nice. And John, last but very certainly not least, thank you again for everything you're doing around keeping the wheels on the bus, the hamsters spinning inside wheels, and all the amazing stuff you're doing with SNIA and keeping all of us really having these great conversations. What's the best way we can get a hold of you if we want to reach you again, John?
So first, I'll have to admit that whatever it is, my boss would like to know. But I can be reached at john.geldman@kioxia.com, and I also have a LinkedIn area where I can be reached.
Fantastic. Yeah. And we'll, there's a great white paper that's coming up. We're going to be seeing that as soon as it becomes available. We'll probably be able to share that around the data protection white paper. There's tons of great content that goes along with these conversations. So folks, do check out, follow the podcast, smash that like button and subscribe and do all those things that the Zoomers tell us we're supposed to do. But more than anything, connect with these amazing folks. Thank you all for sharing the time with me today.